In Shakespeare's play, Henry V, King Henry puzzles over the purpose of royal ceremony, what he calls this tide of pomp. And what have kings that privates have not too, he asks, save ceremony, save general ceremony. And what art thou, thou idle ceremony? He goes on, O ceremony, show me but thy worth. I haven't given you the lines on the screen because I wanted to draw attention to the idle ceremony that Henry V talks about, thou idle ceremony. Now it's idle as in I-D-O-L, something you might worship, but it sounds like idle, lazy. Henry V knows in Shakespeare's play that it is something, that ceremony is something that men adore, that inspires awe and fear, that it separates kings from men. But he also knows that without it, he is just an ordinary, private man. It is just ceremony. Playwrights, poets, real kings and queens, politicians, courtiers, churchmen, media, historians like me, have worried about royal ceremonies and about the coronation in particular. It has always been the most important ceremony of a British monarch's reign, and therefore the most troubling for kings and commentators alike, for it has to be right if it is to be considered legitimate. It has to have meaning. It has to make a king or a queen in a way that people understand and will accept. In 1838, during a debate about Queen Victoria's forthcoming coronation, the rather radical Earl Fitzwilliam declared that coronations were fit only for barbarous or semi-barbarous ages, for periods when crowns were won and lost by unruly violence and ferocious contests. What, he wondered, was the point of such a spectacle when legitimacy was not in doubt, when Victoria did not need to be made queen? She was queen notwithstanding, and her power was supposed to be limited. Was it appropriate, then, to have such an extravagant, elaborate ceremony? Her predecessor, William IV, had not wanted a ceremony, a coronation, had suggested doing away with it. The survival of the British coronation is unique. No other European country brings out and parades its centuries-old and priceless regalia, robes and carriages. No other country encases it in ancient religious ritual. Spain did away with the coronation in the 14th century. Hereditary right trumped any kind of king-making ceremony. Margarita II of Denmark was proclaimed queen in 1972 by her prime minister. No anointing, no crowning. King William Alexander of the Netherlands was sworn in a decommissioned church after his mother, Queen Beatrix, abdicated in 2013. We don't need a coronation then. And I say the survival of the British coronation, but it is actually the English coronation that has survived and become British. The last coronation in Scotland was in 1651, that of Charles II at Scone, 2 years after his father had been executed by the English Parliament. Charles was duly reminded in a thundering sermon that the crown was a tottering crown, that kings would be toppled if they did not keep their promises to the people or to the established church. After 1651, but before the Act of Union in 1707, England's kings and queens, who were also separately kings and queens of Scotland, were crowned just once, according to the English coronation ritual, down in Westminster Abbey, seated above the stone of Scone, seized from Scotland by Edward I. It is the English coronation, then, that has survived. And now that the monarch has no real political power, the coronation of the 20th century adapted, so the story goes, to celebrate the nation and the success of constitutional monarchy. It would celebrate the absence rather than the presence of power, celebrate the kind of constitution and not a person. The preservation of the ancient ritual promoted the benign and steadying power of tradition at a time when the past felt fragile, or the present felt fragile at the beginning of the 20th century, and the past felt like it was going to be lost. Promoted the virtue of continuity. But these ceremonies, or that sort of sense of the past, also could remind us of what we were no longer. A national ceremony such as a coronation seeks to connect us to our past, however much it has changed. But it's to a past or a version of the past dominated by kings and queens. It seeks to bring the nation together, it is hoped, this is what is often said, in a way that politics cannot. As inaugurating a new era, a coronation tries to look forward and to bring joy, hope, unity. It is a nation's birthday, the courtier and historian Arthur Bryant said in 1953, writing in the official souvenir programme for Elizabeth II's coronation. So coronations often seek to promote a particular set of values that seem important at that time. It was, in 1953, hope and unity in post-war Britain. In his commentary on the new liturgy, Justin Welby, Archbishop of Canterbury, has told us that the message of this 21st century coronation is one of service. I come not to be served, but to serve, Charles will say. And it is not just one nation that this next British coronation seeks to celebrate, but 14 Commonwealth nations, of which the British monarch is still head of state. Although this will certainly change as several Caribbean nations start to move towards becoming republics, and possibly Australia too. The history of the coronation is one of much continuity of form and the key elements, recognition, the oath, anointing, crowning, homage, and the continuity of the symbols of royalty, crown, sceptre, orbs, spurs, ring, robes. But it is also a history of evolution. Over the years, the ceremony has been scrutinised, carefully adapted, reinterpreted, and repackaged to suit its times, so that it could absorb profound religious changes and new ideas about what kings are, and new ideas about what ceremonies are and why they matter. That question, show me but thy worth, that Henry V asks, has been asked several times, always around a coronation. It is the changes that have perhaps ensured its survival in this country. But there is one element, the anointing, whose survival is, I think, the most puzzling. At its heart, the coronation is a ceremony about transformation. And this notion has proved remarkably tenacious. Something seems to happen in a coronation. It retains a certain amount of magic. It is the moment, the anointing is the moment when the rightful heir is anointed with holy oil by the Archbishop of Canterbury, a moment that articulates that a monarch's office is tied to God and bound up with divine grace. It echoes the anointing of biblical kings, priests, and prophets. At the centre of a coronation is a body, and a body that becomes sacred. The familiar props of kingship, the robe, sceptres, orb, ring, crown, can only be bestowed and worn once the monarch has been anointed. They show that this is an anointed monarch. When Elizabeth II was crowned 70 years ago, on 2nd of June 1953, television cameras were, as we know, allowed into Westminster Abbey for the first time. But it was agreed that the anointing of Elizabeth was considered too private and too sacred to be broadcast. So the BBC focused its cameras on the altar, and Archbishop Fisher consecrated the young Queen in private beneath the canopy. The essential meaning shines out clearly, Geoffrey Fisher wrote. The Queen is consecrated to be God's anointed servant. The anointing is the spiritual climax. And I just want to play you the moment when the cameras don't show Elizabeth II. And I'm going to keep returning to this and come back to it at the end of this lecture. So there is a bit of silence in this, but bear with me.
4 Knights of the Garter, the Dukes of Wellington and Portland, the Earl Fortescue and the Viscount Arundel, bring forward a golden canopy, which they hold over Her Majesty, so that the sacred moment of anointing, normally never seen, is shielded from all eyes. We shall hear the words of the Archbishop. As the canopy comes to rest, we see beyond it the gleaming altar cloth of the Abbey.
Be thy hand anointed with holy oil. Be thy breast anointed with holy oil. Be thy head anointed with holy oil, as kings and priests and prophets were anointed. And as Solomon was anointed king by Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet, so be thou anointed, blessed, and consecrated, Queen over the people, whom the Lord thy God hath given thee to rule and govern. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen.
Prior to Elizabeth II's coronation, Alan Donn, Dean of Westminster, had appealed to the continuity of the meaning of the English coronation. Compared to the ups and downs and the messiness of life and history, the spiritual meaning of the ceremony had remained constant. He wrote, no matter how greatly outward circumstances have changed, the girding with the sword, the clothing with the royal robe, the presentation of the orb with the cross, the ring, and the two sceptres, all these, with the culminating act of coronation, are charged with spiritual meaning and intent, which have remained constant for the past 1,200 years. For the Church, perhaps for the monarch too, it is the monarch's relationship with God, the gift of God's grace, and the monarch's spiritual role that animate and continue to animate this ceremony, and which continues to define, not unproblematically, I would say, what British monarchy is. I became interested in coronations as a historian of the early modern period, of the English Reformation and the Tudor monarchs. I came across a footnote in an article one day that referred just in passing to a scandal that had occurred during Elizabeth I's coronation in 1559, something that frustrated attempts to understand what this ceremony was doing. The scandal concerned whether Mass was celebrated during this coronation according to the Catholic rite or the Reformed Protestant rite. Was this a Protestant or a Catholic ceremony? Accounts are contradictory. No television cameras then for us to be able to check. The ceremony was being keenly watched by ardent reformers and loyal Catholics alike, keen to know just how Protestant this new queen was going to be. But to add to the confusion, Elizabeth, like Elizabeth II, chose to hide herself in a curtained closet just as the Mass was being celebrated. So we don't exactly know how the Mass was celebrated, and we also don't know what Elizabeth thought of what happened. Whether her bishop did or did not elevate the elements, we don't know, and we don't know why she hid herself or what her attitude was towards that. She was cleverly concealed at a key moment of the ceremony. This prompted me to want to understand what a coronation was in 16th century England. I wanted to know how the coronation, as the most important ceremony in a monarch's reign, could withstand and survive the shocks of the Reformation, a time when religious rituals and gestures were scrutinised, challenged, redefined, and, to a certain extent, demystified. Ceremonies don't actually do anything anymore, do they? Hence Henry V being written by Shakespeare at the end of the 16th century. What is ceremony? Idle ceremony. As part of that Reformation scrutiny of what ceremonies can be. And at the same time as all this was going on, Henry VIII was augmenting his power, and a coronation would need to present the monarch not as one devoted to the Pope, but now as the supreme head of the Church of England. So we have a moment when the ceremony has both been kind of dampened down because of the kind of general anxieties around ceremony, and heightened because it is now having to proclaim the king as the supreme head of the Church of England. For a Tudor monarch, as for the medieval predecessors, the anointing remained central to their conception of themselves as divinely appointed rulers. Mary I reminded rebellious Londoners in February 1554 that she was their anointed queen and that they should therefore let her marry who she wanted. And Elizabeth, similarly, she is, when confronting her parliaments who were clamouring for her to marry, she pointed out that she had been anointed by God and should therefore be obeyed. How could the concept of sacred monarchy developed through the development of the Catholic Church survive the Reformation's attack on idolatry? We haven't seen a coronation for 70 years, but in the 16th century there were 5 coronations in 50 years due to Henry's multiple marriages and lack of grandchildren. So fertile ground for me to study the coronations when there were so many. Not only was there the challenge of religious change and the establishment of the supremacy, but this time also saw the coronation of the first ever queen regnant in England, Mary I in 1553. My talk this evening cannot, of course, cover the history of the coronation in its entirety. I want to introduce its earliest beginnings, but I will then focus on the 16th and 17th centuries, including a few of the coronations of these Tudors here, and James I, and Charles II, moving to William and Mary in 1689. For it is, I want to argue, during this period that the coronation that we know and understand it today was forged. What a king was changed dramatically during this time, and the coronation was adapted accordingly and to reflect the new Protestant religion. At the same time, Great Britain was emerging with the pursuit of a union with Scotland begun by James I, continued by Cromwell, not realised until 1707. The strange survival of the British coronation owes much to this time. I will begin, however, with a brief overview of the medieval origins of the English coronation ceremony. Anglo-Saxon kings were inaugurated with a helmet and a sword at first, but outside on a mound. It is not until the mid-8th and 9th centuries that kingship shifted to become an ecclesiastical office and that coronations became religious services. The Anglo-Saxon rites were Christianized. The first king that we know was anointed with holy oil was King Edgar, as part of a service in Bath Abbey in 973, conducted by the then Archbishop of Canterbury. It was in imitation of the anointing of priests and bishops. It had been adopted by the Frankish kings, by Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Emperor, in 800, and quickly became the tradition throughout Western Europe. Every other king thought, yeah, we'll have some of that. The anointing had biblical roots. Kings were anointed as priests, prophets, and kings, as kings were in the Old Testament. This is what we heard the Archbishop saying in that prayer that he uttered as he was anointing Elizabeth, even though we couldn't see her. It echoes the anointing of David by Samuel, Solomon by Zadok the priest, and Nathan the prophet. The king was understood to be turned into the Lord's anointed, set apart, transformed, elevated by this act. He became an anointed one, Christ-like. And at the anointing, and this is still the case, the accompanying anthem recalls how Zadok, the priest, anointed Solomon. And it's now famous because of Handel's score written in 1727 for the coronation of George II. And we will hear that on Saturday, Zadok, the priest, the sort of soaring score by Handel, but which set to the words, the ancient words of the anthem, the prayer that is uttered at the moment of anointing. The liturgy, the religious script for the coronation, and the blueprint for the entire ceremony became settled in the 14th century, written down in the Liber Regalis, the Book of Kings. And these images that I had up are from the Liber Regalis. Illuminated manuscript, treasure of Westminster Abbey Library. It stipulates, there's the Latin text, the Latin rite of service for the coronation of a king and of a queen consort, not a queen regnant. That was unimaginable. The book also includes the funeral service of a king, a reminder that the coronation of one king is closely related in time and in meaning to the funeral of the predecessor. The last time we saw that imperial state crown was on the coffin of Elizabeth II, and we will now then see it again in the Abbey when Charles III wears it at the end of the ceremony. The Liber Regalis is a prompt book, a coronation prompt book, really detailed script as well. It's absolutely obsessive about the detail, what should be worn, how a queen consort's hair should be down. It stipulates that it must be the Archbishop of Canterbury who officiates, but should be instructed by the Dean of Westminster. It tells us how and where the monarch should be anointed, in which order. It tells us in which order the regalia should be processed up the abbey, and then the order in which it should be bestowed on the monarch. It tells us the prayers that should be uttered and the anthems that should be sung. It details how the abbey should be dressed and prepared, that the 700-year-old coronation chair, well, now it's 700-year-old, at that point it was quite new, should be used, and that a big stage should be built at the transept with steps leading up to it, and a throne on the top. The stage is lower now than it used to be in medieval times. It used to be really high, but there still will be a stage, and they've been busy building it this week. The form of the ceremony written down in the Liber Regalis belongs to a time when the legitimacy of a monarch was intimately bound up with the correct observance of ceremony and with precedent. Things were expected to be done according to the usual ceremonies. If everything was done correctly, this was a sign of God's approval, a kind of backwards logic that something is legitimate if it is done correctly, and if it's done correctly, then God approves. The rise of hereditary monarchy could have rendered the coronation useless, as it did in other countries. In 1308, Edward II, for example, began to rule on the day after his father's death, and this kind of crept closer and closer to the moment of death. Kings would be crowned as soon as possible, particularly if the succession was violent or a bit contested. Henry VII rushed to the Abbey in 1485 to be crowned. So even with the rise of hereditary monarchy, the act of coronation remained integral as a legitimising moment. Chronicles often begin with the coronation, not with the procession, and they mention the anointing. The anointing has often caused tension between king and clergy. In the 13th century, Henry III, there he is on the left, asked Robert Grosseteste, Bishop of Lincoln, what happened to him when he was anointed. Didn't it increase his royal dignity? How priestly did it make him? Priests were anointed, so if he's being anointed, what's actually going on? His bishop replied that while being anointed certainly elevated him above his fellows, it did not quite elevate him above his clergymen. It does not in any way raise the dignity of a king above, nor even to the level of that of the priest, he said. Nevertheless, when anointed, the king would look elevated. Once anointed and crowned, he then climbs the steps of the stage to sit on a throne. And sometimes there could be as many as 20 steps for them to go up. Sometimes they would be carried. When Henry IV was crowned in 1399, he's there on the right, it's a bit of a fuzzy picture, he chose not to be hidden under a canopy at the sacred private moment of anointing, but chose to remain visible, so that all in the abbey could see him being anointed with holy oil. He was then carried up the steps to his throne, held aloft by the bishops. This sought to validate his legitimacy, that by being anointed in plain sight like that, it would show that God approved, and therefore the deposition of another anointed king, Richard II, was okay. He had now the approval of God. He was the legitimate king. He also chose to be anointed with really special oil that has a story going back to Thomas Becket. It was the gift of grace transmitted via the oil which was understood, and for a long time still understood, to grant a monarch special healing powers. This belief persisted from the reign of Edward the Confessor in the 11th century right up until the 18th century. All the Tudor monarchs, except perhaps for Edward because he was so young, all touched for scrofula, the tuberculosis-like disease commonly called the king's evil. And the image here shows Mary I touching for scrofula, and on the right, Charles II touching for scrofula, nearly 100 years later. James I believed the age of miracles was past, but he was encouraged to touch for scrofula. Elizabeth I touched for scrofula with increasing frequency during her reign, even though she complained about the stench of the Catholic oil with which she had been anointed. So she sort of underplays the anointing after her coronation, but she does touch for scrofula. There is this real kind of adherence to the belief that the anointing is magic and special. And I don't think it's purely sort of cynical that they think this would get people to come. I think that's us projecting backwards, that ceremonies can't really do anything. What's persisting is that actually something does happen at the moment of anointing. One of the reasons the coronation has survived is because it is a ceremony crowded with symbolism. So if the anointing is a problem, there are other elements which can kind of counter it. It's really busy, a coronation. It is able to contain multiple, even competing versions of what a king actually is. As it has evolved over the years, it has retained the earliest elements of recognition and consent. And it retains the oath. So that moment of recognition is a kind of hangover from the Anglo-Saxon rite, which will kind of acknowledge a king has been chosen, and do you give your consent to that king? The coronation oath is the king's promise to his people and his church to uphold laws, customs, and established religion. It used to be at the end of the service. Now it is at the beginning, before the anointing. And it has a fraught history, one that was only resolved at the end of the 17th century. In 1509, Henry VIII was crowned alongside Catherine of Aragon on Midsummer's Day. They always choose a special day. He swore, as his predecessor had done, to uphold laws that had already been made and to uphold laws that would be made in the future during his reign. This is really important. He was bound at his coronation to uphold laws not yet made by Parliament. He also swore to recognise and defend the laws of his clergy. But by the early 1530s, Henry revisited his coronation oath and sought to bring it in line with his newfound, expanded prerogative, his supremacy. Anxious that his oath should correctly articulate what he believed the office of kingship should be, he decided to revise the oath and hand that down to his future heir and successors. A manuscript survives in the British Library, which records the changes Henry wished to make, and all that scratchy rubbing out and scrawly writing is Henry's hand. He added in his own hand that he would promise to uphold laws and approved customs of his realm, as long as they were not prejudicial to his crown or imperial jurisdiction, and as long as they were chosen with his consent. So in 1509, he swore to keep such laws as to the honour of God shall be chosen by the people. And in 1533, he went back to his coronation oath, revised it, so that it would say he would hold laws and approved customs of the realm as long as they were not prejudicial to his crown or imperial jurisdiction. This new oath put Henry and his future heirs, he hoped it would put them above the law. This was a startling new conception of his royal power. It couldn't really be allowed in this form, and Henry's extreme revised version was not sworn by any of his children in quite this way. But they did up their prerogative a little. Mary I, for example, added that she would seek to uphold just and licit laws. So she would uphold laws as long as they were just and licit, well, according to whom? But the Stuart kings, James I, Charles I, and Charles II, as Charles II in the Abbey, did swear a revised oath, and one that bound them to uphold laws as long as they were agreeable to the prerogative of the kings. And this got Charles I in trouble. At his trial in 1649, the prosecutor, at Charles I's trial in 1649, the prosecutor, John Cook, had intended to accuse Charles I of instructing Archbishop Laud to amend the coronation oath so that it augmented his prerogative. He never got to actually accuse Charles of doing this because Charles refused to recognise the court, and therefore the proceedings no witnesses were called and the proceedings didn't continue. But this is what he wanted to do. He wanted to catch him out with his oath. The oath was central to the debates between Charles and Parliament in the 1640s. In 1642, Parliament argued that his oath bound Charles I to approve Parliament's laws. Charles refuted this. He argued he had a right to veto. So Parliament argued to Charles that kings stand engaged both in conscience and in justice to give their royal assent, in respect of the oath that is or ought to be taken by the kings of this realm at their coronation. You promised that you would uphold laws that will be made by Parliament. But laws could not be made without a king, Charles I maintained. Where the word of a king is, there is power, he said, quoting from the Bible on the first day of his trial. It was then a bold statement for Charles II to swear this same oath at his coronation in 1661, an oath which still allowed for ambiguity. Was the king above or below the law? It was not until 1688 that the confusion was cleared up by an Act of Parliament that was passed before the coronation of William and Mary in 1689. This committed the wording of the oath to law, and this wording can only now be changed by another Act of Parliament. The word prerogative struck out, and the English and Scottish monarchs unambiguously promised to follow the laws agreed in Parliament. This marked the beginning of constitutional monarchy, as well as the end of any Catholic heirs. From now on, the succession would be Protestant, but at least the kings would follow law. The coronation, then, has had to contain competing conceptions of the nature of royal power and the relationship between monarch and Parliament. Well before Charles I and William and Mary, Parliament had been flexing its muscles in another context. In 1553, the first Queen Regnant, Mary I, was crowned. There she is on the left. I don't know if anyone has ever seen Mary I look like that. She looks rather like Elizabeth. This is from a plea roll, an image from a plea roll. The accession of England's first queen in 1553 was, for some, catastrophic. Mary I was also Catholic and, in Parliament's eyes, still a bastard. For the Scottish churchman and reformer John Knox, the image of a woman bearing the regalia with men kneeling before her was simply monstrous and counter to God's will. How could a woman, he bellowed, sit as God's lieutenant? How could men pay homage to a queen? There was no precedent for crowning a queen regnant. The Liber Regalis did not include an order of service for a queen's coronation, only for a queen consort. Mary I's councillors put their heads together to deliberate over what should be done, and they came up with a radical proposal. Parliament had never revoked the bastard status conferred on Mary following the birth of Elizabeth and the 1536 Act of Succession, and this was potentially problematic. Mary's councillors therefore proposed to Mary that she should be made queen in Parliament first before her coronation could take place. This was an unprecedented reversal of the traditional order. If Parliament was sitting when an English monarch died, Parliament would automatically dissolve and would only sit again once the new monarch had been anointed and crowned. This doesn't happen anymore, although it's really interesting that Charles III's coronation has been nicely timed to kind of coincide with this session of Parliament that will close, and then he'll be able to open it as a crowned monarch. But in 1553, to reverse the order, to open a Parliament and to declare that Queen through that Parliament was an unparalleled constitutional move and had real consequences, could have real consequences for the Queen's power. And Mary knew this. She was distressed on hearing this proposal, and she consulted her closest advisors, the imperial ambassadors. They were appalled at the novelties that England was entertaining. They commented how the English were capricious seekers after novelty, always fiddling with things and changing things. Mary and her advisors suspected, rightly, that because Mary was a woman and a Catholic, that this pre-coronation Parliament would seek to bridle her, and that's the word that's used, and a word that used by Mary and her councillors. They think she's going to be bridled by this Parliament, that would make her more dependent on council and Parliament than she should be, that it would dilute her power. She would, in short, owe her position to Parliament first, and not to God. She would be crowned queen by Parliament and would be anointed as a different kind of queen as a result. Mary said no. Customarily defiant, no, she said, and she pressed ahead with the plans for her coronation, releasing Bishop Gardiner from the Tower so that he could officiate, and commissioning special secret oils to be sent over from Belgium so that she did not have to be anointed with Protestant oil that had been consecrated according to the Edwardian Church. Her ceremony was long and full. It lasted for 7 hours, and she was anointed and crowned just like a king, and invested with the full set of regalia, robe, sceptre, orb, ring, spurs. She didn't actually have to put the spurs on. Like a queen consort, she wore cloth of gold and had her hair down, as in this image, sign of fertility. So, even though she rejected the proposal, what she did do was establish a precedent for the crowning of a queen, which her sister then followed, Elizabeth I, in the image on the right. She even wore Mary's dress, with the bodice slightly tweaked. Another part of the busyness of a coronation is the coronation procession. For a long time, the service was accompanied by the pre-coronation procession, a medieval tradition during which the monarch would process from the Tower of London to Westminster Abbey. The Liber Regalis stipulates that this was necessary, that the monarch would move from having occupied the Tower of London, move through the City of London to Westminster before their coronation. The Liber Regalis said that the king needed to be seen by the people on his way to the coronation, to be welcomed and accepted. These processions are replaced now by a procession after the coronation, and with picnics and concerts. But they provided opportunities in the early modern period, particularly for those choreographing the events, to put a gloss on the coronation ceremony, to use the procession to kind of explain what they think is about to happen the next day. So when Elizabeth I was crowned in 1559, here she is, in her letter, there she is there, London put on a spectacular show. A series of pageants dotted along the procession route ensured that everyone understood that here was a Protestant queen, and a thoroughly English queen who would embrace pure religion. Pageants showed her an image of the queen kind of trampling on superstition. Watch out, Catholics. It promised that her reign would be fertile. It was inconceivable in 1559 that this young queen would not marry and would not have children. This wasn't all staged by the court, but actually by London, by the guilds and the companies that put on these shows. It was an opportunity for them to speak to the monarch, tell her what they wanted her to be, what they hoped she would do. In 1661, Charles II staged a dazzling procession through London. Some, including bewildered foreign ambassadors, commented on its exorbitant cost. Nothing much changes there. But others were awestruck. "It is impossible to relate the glory of this day," Samuel Pepys wrote in his diary. One Puritan observer in his diary noted that it was a pompous show. But Samuel Pepys, let's not forget, had worked for Edward Montagu, Oliver Cromwell's general at sea, and both had switched allegiance. For this procession happened after the years of the Republic, and this procession had to work really hard to obliterate the years of the Republic and re-establish monarchy. This procession and all the pageants and poetry and speeches that accompanied it sought to declare monarchy as natural and permanent. Talked about the glorious light of monarchy returning after the dismal night of usurpation. This procession could not suppress the truth that the Republic had exposed. Monarchy was not the only form of government and might not even be approved of by God. The procession kind of knows this, but it pretends it doesn't. And I think this is a really interesting moment of these ceremonies, sort of creating a kind of fiction of long-lasting, continuous monarchy. Charles's restoration was not inevitable, but history has led us to believe it was. And processions like this have played a part in that by talking about the monarchy as this light that's returning as natural, permanent, and unchanging. But many of those in this procession, including George Monk here, right on the right, he's looking out at us, interestingly. George Monk there as Master of the Horse, but he had been quite happy for a long time serving Cromwell. Those organising Charles II's coronation combed through the historical records and scrutinised precedent to make sure that this ceremony looked just like the coronations of his medieval and Tudor ancestors, and that all the ancient customs were correctly followed. St. Edward's regalia, believed to date back to the reign of Edward the Confessor and used at coronation since the reign of Henry III, was broken apart and melted down by order of Parliament in 1649, not by Cromwell. Cromwell was in Ireland. I mean, he was up to no good in Ireland, but he was in Ireland when Parliament passed the act to destroy the regalia. They did not need it anymore. Monarchy had been abolished. But in 1661, the regalia that we are going to see on Saturday was recommissioned. The anointing spoon is the only medieval item to have survived, dates from the 12th century. It was bought at the great sale of Charles I's stuff by Clement Kinnersley, who had worked for the royal wardrobe and went on to work for Cromwell. So many people say, oh, he saved it, he preserved it, he kept it. Well, he bought it and then went on to work in the household for Cromwell, and then gave it back. Charles II's coronation is significant for enabling the powerful story that is told about the British monarchy, that it has always been there, and its ceremonies have stayed the same. It was a masterpiece of ceremonial resurrection, as those watching this ceremony must have known, and as we know, it could have all gone a different way, and it still could. Triumphant it may look, but it was not sure. It was really still very unsettled in 1661 and through the 1660s. For all the procession's elaborate pageantry extolling the hand of God, it was Parliament that brought back Charles II, not God. Part of the power of such spectacle derives, ironically, from knowing that it could dissolve, like an insubstantial pageant. And as real power really did wane eventually with Charles II's successors, there seemed no harm in enjoying the theatre and in witnessing the dramatisation of the past and connecting with an ancient desire to create and crown kings. I think it's in the spirit of Charles II's coronation that the modern, the 20th century coronation was kind of devised, this sort of nostalgia, deliberately looking to the past, deliberately archaic, invoking the past and valuing it. That one of its kind of values was that has always been that way. But what then of the anointing? I want to end with how I began, with this puzzle of the anointing. How does the anointing still fit into a ceremony that had to embrace an entirely new understanding of what a monarch is in relation to Parliament and to law that the 16th and 17th centuries worked out? As with all parts of the ceremony, the anointing was tinkered with. In 1603, for James I's coronation, the Latin service was translated into English for the first time. It was the first properly Protestant ceremony. And there is an image of him in the abbey with the altar as a table, not as a high altar, but an ordinary table. It's the Reformed abbey. The anointing was retained, but not without some angst about the wording that should accompany it. How should they translate that prayer that suggests a physical transformation is brought about by the anointing, by God's grace entering the body of the king, this emphasis on the body? A first draft of the translation held in Lambeth Palace Library has been marked up, as shown in this slide there. Well, I'll show you the unmarked version first. They had a first draft of the translation, and then a correcting hand has gone over it. It's brilliant to be able to see them changing their minds. We can't have that word. The revisions downplay any notion of the materiality of God's grace. In the Liber Regalis, the anthem Veni Creator Spiritus, translated as Come Holy Ghost, which we're going to hear in several different languages on Saturday, and the prayers that preface the anointing beckon the gift of grace imparted by God. The Archbishop's words then articulate that it is through the oil that grace is transmitted and the king made king. The Latin is through the holy oil, through unction. But when this translation is marked up, the rubric specifying that the archbishop should make the sign of the cross at the moment of the anointing is struck out. It should just be touched, as is this phrase, enter into the bowels of thy heart. Too physical. Also, any connection between the visible oil and invisible grace is downplayed. So they take out by this visible gift. There is no connection between the anointing and the receipt of grace. The king is anointed so that he may receive grace rather than receiving grace as a result of being anointed. It was usual for a coronation to include a sermon. There'll be a sermon at Charles III's coronation for the first time since 1911, when there was a sermon at the coronation of George V and Queen Mary. It's an interesting restoration. In a ceremony that they wanted to cut short, they're now adding the sermon, and it will gloss the ceremony, as sermons always did. In 1603, Thomas Bilson, Bishop of Winchester, delivered the sermon before James I, and he took as his theme the anointing. He glossed it in such a way that he talked about the anointing as being simply an external sign, rendering visible what was already true, that James was approved by God, that he'd already been granted God's grace, that his authority, dignity, and duty derived from God, and that he would serve God. So it is a sign of something that we can't see, a sign that James is already king. There's no kind of direct connection between I'm anointing you and changing you. It could therefore be preserved in a Protestant ceremony in good conscience. It would be okay to keep it. It never can quite do away with the fact that something happens, though. A few years later, Lancelot Andrews, the Anglican-leaning Bishop of Chichester, who valued ceremony, preached to James and brought up the anointing at his coronation. The truth is, he told James, the ceremony doth not anything, only declareth what is done. So it's valuable as a ceremony, as a ritual, for what it is saying as an external sign of something that has already happened, as kind of commemorative. This is a new conception of ceremony, a new understanding of ritual that can now be applied to coronation. And it takes part in a kind of a climate of rethinking the value of ceremony, which had begun in the 16th century. William Cavendish, Marquess of Newcastle, writes a kind of set of instructions, kind of advice to Charles II, in which he tells him about ceremony. Charles I had been really worried about being reduced to just ceremony. He said, well, if I don't have any power, that's rubbish. You can't just be just a symbol. But Cavendish and others turned this around and actually say ceremony in itself is valuable, that external symbolism. Ceremony, though it is nothing in itself, he said, yet it doth everything. Hence the big procession in 1661. It is valuable, it is a spectacle, it has other work to do. Way back in 1531, Thomas Eliot, in the book named The Governor, also wrote interestingly about a king's ceremonies. He appeals to the human desire for outward significations, for spectacle to perform and show what is true but what we can't always see. In the case of a monarch's coronation, Eliot argued, this could inspire respect and obedience. He says, let it also be considered that we be men and not angels, this is right at the end, wherefore we know nothing but by outward significations. Why should kings be crowned in public? Why should they receive their crown and all their props? It's a way of inspiring, he says, reverence, beholders, that word beholders, if you're kind of sort of being struck by something. It would inspire obedience, but also we are men and we are not angels. We know nothing but by outward significations. Someone like John Milton, though, railed against this human desire to be awed and cowed by the spectacle of a king. Pomp and ceremony makes unthinking servants of us, he thought. And in Paradise Lost, he refers to the easy yoke of servile pomp. In the 19th century, the constitutional historian Bagehot argued the same, but in defence of monarchy in its ceremonies. Royalty was strong precisely because it could appeal to feeling. Royalty will be strong because it appeals to diffused feeling. Republics weak because they appeal to understanding. Something that Milton also knew. He knew that intellectually a republic should work, but he knew that the English were seduced, easily seduced, would easily run back into the yoke of servile pomp. A few years ago, the Hilary Mantel wrote about the continuity of this desire to want to watch and to be dazzled. The Queen, she wrote, was a thing that existed only to be looked at, and the faculty of awe remains intact. In a ceremony that will be highly visible and broadcast across the world, that will invite everyone, or invite everyone to pledge allegiance, and that is working so hard to be inclusive and uniting, and to emphasise monarchy as service, Charles III's coronation is going to attempt to inspire awe, I think. His anointing will be hidden. A screen will be held up before Charles when he is seated in the coronation chair. The move is a deeply religious one and an example of ceremonial theatrics, a deliberate piece of choreography in the way that Henry IV wanted to be elevated and shown, in the way that Elizabeth II hid herself at the moment of Mass. It will ensure at Charles III's coronation that the anointing remains the most sacred and the most mysterious part of the ceremony. Welby, in his commentary, has written that it symbolises the presence of God during this moment. But it will emphasise and draw attention to, not unproblematically, what has always underpinned the coronation ceremony, that the monarch is the Lord's anointed. Is there a place for this in a constitutional monarchy? It risks, I think, prioritising the anointing over the oath. I'm not sure how comfortably this kind of emphasis can sit within a coronation that we know is seeking to include all faiths and to present an image of a humble king here to serve all peoples. It will ensure that that moment of magic or awe, and with all its complications and difficulty, that will be preserved. That something, we won't see something. Flexibility is the hallmark of British coronations, and the revisions being made to the ceremony in 2023 connect to all those moments in the past when committees of people gathered to think seriously and hard about what a coronation was and whether they should change it and how. There is always a bit of a risk. Will it work? Will it match the times? Can it reflect what we think a king is or should be? I've been asked a lot recently over the last couple of weeks whether this will be the last such coronation we are ever likely to see. I think as long as there is such a commitment to reworking the ceremony, to trying to adapt it, even if they get some things wrong, that there is life in it yet. But I will just say, please show us the anointing. Thank you. Oh, I never got to him, sorry.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hunt, for such a fascinating lecture. I had a very quick question. Actually, I'm going to go straight into, we've got the mic here. Who has questions for Dr. Hunt?
I don't know if you can speak a bit about who attends coronations, in the past, and I suppose because I read yesterday that Ant and Dec are attending, so I just thought it's interesting to know who's attended in the past and how it's changed.
Well, I think this coronation is going to be really different in terms of that there's the Ant and Decs and the Harry Kanes, but also the charitable workers and NHS, and not so many foreign royals, and not all the kinds of, not all the peers. So it will look really quite different in the Abbey. Some of the images I've showed showed that the absolutely stuffed full, with scaffolding, with seats everywhere, but all in their robes, the nobility. That no ordinary people would be allowed in, hence the procession being so important, because that was the only way you would get a glimpse of the monarch. So this marks a departure even from Elizabeth II's coronation, that there will be different people in the Abbey. But before, nobility, politicians, obviously. And it is Parliament's ceremony. I mean, it is the government ceremony. They come up with the guest list. That wasn't always the case, of course. But this one will be different for there being some more general public there.
Thank you. It seemed to me for very many years that the greatest problem for the coronation to be an inclusive one is the fact that it's two ceremonies in one. Crowning the monarch, but also so much of it is installing the monarch as governor of the established church, the Church of England, which I think should be two separate ceremonies, because I don't see how it can be inclusive when it does that, and you have in the liturgy preserving the rights of my bishops and all this, and that seems to be a major problem to me.
I think I agree. I think it's trying to do too many things. I think yes, a separate ceremony is establishing the monarch as head of the Church of England. But another ceremony, I think the oath could be taken out of it, for example, and that could be done at the moment of accession and with the proclamation. Yes, I think I agree. It is too ambitious, I think, and it's becoming increasingly obvious, I think, in this coronation that it's trying to do. It so wants to be inclusive and diverse, but it can't change what it is, which is a deeply religious Anglican ceremony.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hunt. I'm afraid we have got to 7 o'clock, so if anyone has any questions for Dr. Hunt, could you come up and ask her at the end? But could I also just say, if you are watching online or in person today, we've got a lecture on Barts. That's the hospital, the 900-year-old hospital and its history on Thursday night. So please do come along for that. Thanks very much. Thank you, Dr. Hunt.